Imagine a vast country in South America with jungles, endless rivers, mountains, and one of the highest waterfalls on the planet. Today, we know this country as Venezuela. But long before Spanish ships arrived, long before the maps where this name appeared, people were already living here. Their civilizations existed for thousands of years. They hunted in the jungles, sailed the Orinoco, built villages on the water, and created their own worlds, myths, and traditions. If we want to understand the true history of Venezuela, we must go back, very far back, thousands of years before the Europeans. Who were the first people of this land? Where did they come from? What nations lived in the territory of future Venezuela? Why did some of them build houses directly over the water? And what was life like in these places before the colonizers appeared? Today, we journey into the distant past to discover who truly lived on the land of Venezuela before Venezuela itself existed. Chapter 2. The First People on Venezuelan Soil. The human history of modern-day Venezuela begins a very long time ago. Archaeologists believe the first humans appeared here approximately 15,000 to 20,000 years ago. They arrived gradually, moving from North America through Central America and further into the south. These people did not build cities or leave behind great monuments. However, they left traces of their lives: stone tools, spearheads, remains of fires, and rock paintings. They were hunter-gatherers. Their lives depended on nature. They hunted large animals, caught fish, and gathered fruits and roots. The jungles of Venezuela provided everything necessary for life: water, food, and shelter. The first inhabitants were highly mobile, moving frequently to follow animals and seasons. Their groups were small, usually consisting of a few dozen people. But over time, people began to settle in one place. In the river valleys and along the coast, the first permanent settlements began to appear. The Orinoco became an especially important river for the future peoples of Venezuela. This massive river, over 2,000 kilometers long, became a true artery of life. People traveled along it, transported goods, and different tribes communicated through it. It was along this river that the region's first cultures gradually began to form. Chapter 3. First Cultures and Archaeological Finds. Archaeologists have found many ancient human sites in Venezuela. One of the most famous is in the Taima area. There, ancient spears and the bones of animals hunted by the first inhabitants were discovered. Some finds show that people here even hunted giant Ice Age animals, mastodons, and giant sloths. This suggests that the first inhabitants of Venezuela were skilled hunters who adapted well to their environment. Later, about 5,000 to 3,000 years ago, more developed cultures began to appear in the region. People started growing plants, building more permanent settlements, and creating ceramics. The first clay vessels, jewelry, and simple tools appeared. From this point on, life in the region began to change gradually. Tribes became more organized and their culture more complex. Chapter 4. Nations before the Europeans. By the time Christopher Columbus's ships approached the shores of Venezuela at the end of the 15th century, dozens of different nations already lived there. Each had its own language, traditions, and culture. Among the most famous were the Arawak tribes, the Carib tribes, and the Timoto-Cuica. These nations occupied different regions of the country. Some lived in the Amazon jungle, some on the Caribbean coast, and others in the Andes Mountains. Their lifestyles varied greatly. Some were fishermen and navigators, others were farmers, and others were jungle hunters. But all of them were part of the complex world of the indigenous peoples of South America. These nations were the true masters of the land long before the Europeans arrived. Chapter 5. The Arawak Peoples. One of the most numerous peoples living in the territory of future Venezuela were the Arawak tribes. The Arawaks settled across a vast territory of South America and the Caribbean basin. Their settlements could be found along rivers, on the coasts, and even on the Caribbean islands. The Arawaks were primarily farmers. They grew cassava, manioc, a plant that became the dietary staple for many peoples in the region. From cassava, they made flatbreads, flour, and various dishes. In addition to cassava, they grew corn, sweet potatoes, peppers, and squash. The life of the Arawaks was closely connected to nature. They knew jungle plants well and used them for both food and medicine. Arawak villages were usually located near rivers. In the center of the settlement stood large communal houses where several families could live at once. The tribal chief played an important role, making decisions and organizing hunts, but his power was not absolute. Many decisions were made together with a council of elders. The Arawaks were also known as skilled craftsmen, creating beautiful ceramics, jewelry from shells and stones, and woven baskets and fabrics. Chapter 6. The Carib Tribes. Another important people of the region were the Caribs. Unlike the more peaceful Arawaks, the Carib tribes were famous for their warrior spirit. It is because of them that the Caribbean Sea got its name. The Caribs were excellent warriors and navigators. They built long canoes that could cover great distances at sea and on rivers, sometimes holding dozens of warriors. This allowed the Caribs to carry out long-distance expeditions and control large territories. They often fought with neighboring tribes to expand their influence. Military culture was a vital part of their society. Young men had to prove their bravery in battle. However, the Caribs were not just warriors. They also engaged in fishing, hunting, and farming. Their villages were often located on the coast or near large rivers, with houses built of wood and palm leaves. The Carib tribes also had a rich spiritual culture, believing in nature spirits and performing rituals. Chapter 8. Why was Venezuela called Little Venice? When Europeans first saw the coast of Venezuela, they were surprised by one unusual feature. In some areas, people built their houses directly over the water. The houses stood on wooden stilts with channels running between them. People moved between houses in boats. In 1499, Spanish explorers saw such settlements on Lake Maracaibo. The Italian navigator Amerigo Vespucci noticed that these settlements reminded him of Venice, the city of canals in Italy. Therefore, he called this land Venezuela, which means Little Venice. But these settlements existed long before the Europeans arrived. They were built by the indigenous peoples of the region, who had perfectly adapted to life near the water. Chapter 9. Life in Indigenous Villages. The life of indigenous peoples was closely tied to nature. Every day depended on rivers, forests, and animals. Men usually engaged in hunting and fishing, using spears, bows, and arrows. Hunting took place in the dense jungles inhabited by deer, monkeys, birds, and many other animals. Fishing was also a very important part of life. Tribes caught fish in rivers and lakes using nets, harpoons, and special trap baskets. Women were mainly engaged in agriculture and housekeeping. They grew cassava, corn, beans, and various fruits. From cassava, they prepared special flatbreads that could be stored for a long time. Women also made pottery, wove baskets, and created clothing from plant fibers. Children learned from adults from an early age, observing hunts and learning to grow plants. Knowledge was passed down orally through stories, legends, and myths. Chapter 11. Trade between tribes. Despite many tribes living far apart, trade links existed. Chapter 9. Life in Indigenous Villages. The life of indigenous peoples was closely tied to nature. Every day depended on rivers, forests, and animals. Men usually engaged in hunting and fishing, using spears, bows, and arrows. Hunting took place in the dense jungles inhabited by deer, monkeys, birds, and many other animals. Fishing was also a very important part of life. Tribes caught fish in rivers and lakes using nets, harpoons, and special trap baskets. Women were mainly engaged in agriculture and housekeeping. They grew cassava, corn, beans, and various fruits. From cassava, they prepared special flatbreads that could be stored for a long time. Women also made pottery, wove baskets, and created clothing from plant fibers. Children learned from adults from an early age, observing hunts and learning to grow plants. Knowledge was passed down orally through stories, legends, and myths. Chapter 11. Trade between tribes. Despite many tribes living far apart, trade links existed between them. People exchanged food, tools, and jewelry. For example, mountain tribes might trade their goods for fish or seashells from coastal peoples. Shells were often used as jewelry and even as a form of currency. People traveled by canoe along the rivers to transport goods and meet other tribes. Sometimes these encounters were peaceful, turning into trade exchanges and festivals. However, conflicts also occurred between tribes, especially over territory or resources. Chapter 12. First encounters with Europeans. In 1498, the ships of Christopher Columbus's third expedition reached the shores of South America. Columbus arrived at the coast that is now part of Venezuela. To the Europeans, these lands seemed mysterious and rich in natural resources. They saw dense forests, vast rivers, and numerous indigenous settlements. To the local inhabitants, the appearance of European ships marked a new era. Initially, contacts were infrequent. Europeans traded various goods, glass beads, metal objects, and fabrics to the locals. But very soon, these meetings began to change the fate of the region. Chapter 13. Tribes of the Future Venezuela. By the time the Europeans arrived, modern-day Venezuela was inhabited by dozens of different nations. Each tribe had its own language, culture, and way of life. Some lived along the Caribbean coast, others deep in the Amazon jungle, and others high in the Andes. Among the well-known peoples were the Wayuu, Payman, Warao, Yanomami, and many others. The Wayuu lived on the Guajira Peninsula. This region was dry and hot, so they adapted to harsh conditions through cattle herding, fishing, and trade. They were also famous for their weaving. The Warao lived in the Orinoco Delta. Their lives were entirely tied to the water. They built stilt houses over the river and were often called boat people. The Payman lived on the grand mountain plateaus called tepuis. They considered these stone mountains sacred and told legends about the spirits dwelling there. The Yanomami lived deep in the Amazon. Their settlements were small, featuring large circular structures called chabonos where several families lived together. Chapter 14. Nature and the Indigenous World. The nature of Venezuela was among the most diverse in the world, and it shaped the people's way of life. The Amazon provided plants and animals for hunting. Rivers served as highways and food sources. The mountain climate allowed for agriculture, and the coast supported active fishing. Indigenous peoples knew nature incredibly well. They could distinguish hundreds of plants, knowing which were edible and which were medicinal. Some plants were used to treat wounds, while others fought diseases. This knowledge, passed down through generations, formed the basis of traditional medicine. Chapter 15. Why there were no large empires. When people talk about South American civilizations, they often think of empires like the Incas or Mayans. However, no such massive states emerged in the territory of Venezuela. The main reason was geography. The dense jungles, high mountains, and massive rivers made travel difficult. Tribes often lived in isolation from one another, which prevented the formation of a large centralized state. However, this did not mean their cultures were primitive. They had complex social structures, traditions, and advanced skills in farming, trade, and crafts. Chapter 16. How their fate changed. The arrival of Europeans was a turning point. Following the first explorers came colonizers seeking gold, land, and territory. Spanish colonization gradually began to change the lives of the local peoples. Many tribes were forced to leave their lands, and some were pressed into hard labor on colonial estates. Furthermore, Europeans brought diseases to which the locals had no immunity. As a result, the populations of many tribes decreased sharply. It was a tragedy that changed the destiny of entire nations. Chapter 17. The Indigenous Legacy. Despite the hardships of history, many of Venezuela's indigenous peoples still exist today. Their culture, language, and traditions live on. Currently, dozens of indigenous groups reside in Venezuela, preserving their customs, festivals, and knowledge of nature. Many words from their languages have entered modern Venezuelan Spanish, and their traditions have become part of the country's cultural heritage. The history of Venezuela began long before its modern name appeared, belonging to those who first mastered the land and learned to live within its forests and mountains. Chapter 18. Conclusion. When we speak of Venezuela, we often think of the modern country, its politics, economy, or oil. But the true history of this land began thousands of years ago. Long before European ships, maps, or borders, a rich and complex world of indigenous peoples already existed. They built villages, grew crops, sailed the rivers, and created their own myths. They were the first masters of this land. Although colonization changed their fate, their legacy continues to live today. To truly understand Venezuela, we must remember those who lived on this land long before it ever received its name. If you like my work, subscribe to the channel and like it. Thank you all.